Morning, welcome back to Emergency Athlete. Now, I was doing a lift the other day and one of my colleagues saw me doing this exercise, and afterwards he came over and said, doesn't that lift go against everything we've been taught about picking things up? And it brought about a really good discussion on lifting mechanics, and it's really relevant to anyone in our line of work. Or to anyone that has to pick anything off the floor, to be honest. So the exercise that I was doing is what we call a stiff leg deadlift. And for that exercise, hold a bar about waist height, have a very slight bend in the knees, and then hinge forward from the hips, stretching the hamstrings, and then coming back up to the start position. Now, the question was, doesn't that go against everything that we've been taught? And the simple answer is no. And I'm going to try and show you why now. So just be ready for some incredibly bad drawing. I want you to imagine this. Let's say this is our pelvis, with our leg, and our nice neutral back position. Now, when I'm picking things up, if I keep my pelvis in the same position and use a rounded back to pick it up, that's bad. However, if instead I hinge forward from the pelvis, I can keep my back in its nice, strong, natural braced position. The difference here is that in this lift, the muscles that are taking the strain of the weight are these ones along the back. I'm very good at keeping an upright posture, but they're not that strong overall. In this second example, the muscles that I'm using are my glutes and my hamstrings. And these are much bigger than the muscles of my back. They can take much more weight. So, this brings us on to an interesting point. Whenever we lift anything, the aim is to keep this neutral position, brace it, and maintain that position through the lift. It works for this kind of effort where we're leaning forward, hinging at the hips, but it also works if we have to squat down and pick someone up. We maintain that neutral position throughout. Now, that's all well and good in a gym because we can manage the environment really well. And we control how we lift, when we lift it, how heavy it is. If you're working in the emergency services, I've lost count of the number of people that have slipped down that tiny gap between the wall and the toilet. And now we have to kind of lean in and grab them and pull them out. But there's a couple of really simple rules that we can apply. Firstly, the one joint rule or the single joint rule. And that states that if we're going to do a lift, movement only occurs at one joint, and that's the hip. The way I like to think about it is that rather than imagining my spine is made up of lots of little vertebrae, I imagine that's one long bone. So that can't bend. Once it's in that brace position, that can't bend. It's a pretty simple principle to keep in mind, and when you need to lift a load off the floor, it's a good thing to remember. But also, we're not always going to be in that perfect position. I'm not always going to be able to have this braced spine. And again, it's not the end of the world. We just remember those two rules, the single joint rule and the long bone rule, let's call it that. If I have to pick something up in a position that causes my back to be rounded, as long as I brace in that position and maintain that position throughout the lift, then that's not so bad. It's not ideal, but it's a lot better than the alternative, which is to hold it in this rounded position and then try and straighten out of it, because then once again, we're using these smaller muscles to do the lift rather than the bigger muscles of the legs and the backside. So, it's not ideal, but it's much better than the alternative, which is to use the small muscles of the back. So in conclusion, lots of deadlifts, because they're really good for us and they'll build lots of strength. And the stronger you are in a good position, then if you have to lift in a bad position, you'll be a bit more resilient towards it. Secondly, single joint rule, movement only occurs in the hips. Or the long bone rule, that spine is one long fixed bone, and once it's in position, that position doesn't change from the start of the lift to the finish of the lift. If you have to lift with a rounded back, then it's not ideal. Brace it in that position, keep it in that position until you've completed the lift, and then relax out of it. Keep those in mind. Try and apply them as you're working through your daily job and doing all these lifting things. And as always, if you have any comments, let us know. Thanks very much.